Unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard of J.R.R. Tolkien's epic fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. Ever since Peter Jackson's trilogy, the story has grown even more popular, and since then everyone has been trying to capitalize on this franchise. Recently, Amazon Studios purchased the rights to The Lord of the Rings and released a series based on the novels called The Rings of Power, which is a story supposed to take place in the Second Age and long before the events of Lord of the Rings. The show is visually stunning, but it has received poor reviews from audience members and Tolkien fans like myself, and this is because of two underlying problems. First, the writing was poorly done. The story is filled with plot holes that disconnect you and leave you confused as to what is going on. Characters are supposed to drive the plot, leading to character development. But in Rings of Power, the plot just happens for the most part, and the characters have to react, and sometimes in ways that do not make sense. But there is a deeper problem that people are missing. You, like many others, may watch the series and feel that something is off. It looks like Tolkien's Middle-earth, but it doesn't feel like it. Sure, Tolkien fans have been quick to point out all the lore inaccuracies, and I wholeheartedly agree. But there is a deeper problem that the show creators imbued in the writing that you sense but can't put words to. And it is that the show creators have rejected Tolkien's philosophy. When Tolkien wrote, he imbued in his stories deep philosophical truths that were easy to digest through the medium of narrative. This is the lifeblood of Middle-earth, and it is what makes Lord of the Rings a masterpiece. The philosophy of Tolkien drives the characters to act as they do, which in turn drives the plot forward. And this flow is missing in Rings of Power. In the show, the good guys like Galadriel and Elrond no longer act as if they're working from Tolkien's philosophy, and instead at times seem to be operating from the philosophy of Tolkien's villains. What Tolkien would have deemed as evil, the writers of Rings of Power deem as good. This is a fundamental problem with the show, and why you feel that something is off. First, we need to dive into the highlights of Tolkien's philosophy. What were the life lessons Tolkien wanted us to get from his stories? Peter Kreeft said, "Critics say Tolkien's fantasy is escapist, unrealistic, and irrelevant to modern social problems. The problem is exactly the opposite. It is far too relevant for the critics' comfort." Tolkien, of course, said he wrote for the encouragement of good morals. He also said Lord of the Rings is essentially a Catholic work, and it is about God and his sole right to divine honor, which tells us Catholic themes and messages are woven into his story, both consciously and unconsciously. Tolkien was also a traditionalist, and he prized order and chivalry. Men and women are equal, but are made for different roles. In Middle-earth, hobbits are meant for one way of life, the quiet and simple life in the Shire. Men are meant to live in cities, dwarves in their mines. Everyone is meant to live a certain way. And when they do, they flourish and find true happiness. Happiness is not about choosing your own path or bending the world to your will. True happiness for Tolkien is fulfilling your designed role in the world. Let's go back to the beginning of Tolkien's world to see how this idea is set up. In the Silmarillion, creation begins with a song. The creator Eru sings together with the Ainur to create the world of Tolkien, called Arda, where elves, men, and dwarves will live. A theme in Tolkien's works is the importance of finding your rightful place in this song of creation. And it's a subtle lesson to us about how we should not strive for power or greatness, but we should be happy with where God has placed us in life and find harmony with the role we were created for. But then Tolkien introduces Melkor, the original Dark Lord, who will later be called Morgoth. During the singing of the Ainur, Melkor sows discord into the song, making it chaotic. But then Eru, the god of Tolkien's world, rises from his throne and overtakes the singing of Melkor and brings it into harmony, so that what Melkor meant for chaos, Eru uses for good. The chaos of Melkor is ultimately used by Eru to make the song even more beautiful. So we get the idea that chaos, or evil, is not good, but it can be used by good for a greater purpose. In fact, we get the idea that some chaos is allowed to make the song greater. A truly good story has evil present because the triumph over evil is what really takes the story to another level. Evil is not something that is inherently necessary, but a world with evil allows for character growth that could not have occurred in a world without it. This is very much a Christian idea. as it is seen in the words of St. Paul and St. Augustine, who speak of God allowing evil so that a greater good could come out of it. Through Middle-earth, this is Tolkien's answer to the problem of evil. It is allowed only so that it can be triumphed over by characters who grow out of their experiences with it. But it's important to note that Tolkien does not place order as the highest good. For Tolkien, it is okay to break with tradition or order if your motive is love. At the core of Tolkien's world, love is the greatest force. No power can overcome it, and throughout Tolkien's world, characters are able to do things no one else could because they act out of love. Later in the Silmarillion, we read of the love story of Beren and Luthien. Beren is a mortal man and Luthien is an immortal elf princess. Beren asks for Luthien's hand in marriage, but her father, King Thingol, says he will only allow this if Beren obtains a Silmaril from the crown of the Dark Lord, Morgoth, something no elf lord has been able to achieve. This would have diminished the hopes of any other character, but Beren instead calls it a small price and sets out to obtain the jewel. But he is quickly captured by none other than Sauron. Luthien senses her love is in danger and breaks from her traditional place to save him. With the help of Huan the Hound, she manages to save Beren just in time. Then the two of them later sneak into the fortress of Angband. Luthien sings Morgoth to sleep, and Beren manages to take a Silmaril from his crown. Because they are driven by love and not greed, or glory in defeating the Dark Lord, they manage to do what no warrior was able to do. For Tolkien, their love allows them to do what the most powerful elf could not. It is only when Beren, out of greed, attempts to steal another Silmaril does it lead to their downfall. Morgoth wakes and causes a series of events that actually leads to Beren and Luthien's death. Then the story ends with their love being able to convince the Valar to allow them to return to Middle-earth and live out their lives as mortals. Anyone who attempted to obtain a Silmaril for greed, revenge, or power was ultimately doomed, but Beren and Luthien were allowed to obtain one because it was done out of love for each other. In The Lord of the Rings, the ring itself is a central key to Tolkien's philosophy about the dangers of lusting after power and greed. The ring is designed to tempt you with power and a master plan of how you could shape the world in your image. Boromir succumbs to the ring's temptation and sees himself as a conquering hero, defeating the enemies of Gondor and given the glory he thinks he deserves. When the ring tempts Sam, he sees himself turning Mordor into a beautiful garden for him to rule over. As Joe Kraus says, the ring holds out the false hope of power that people can use to remake the world. But Eric Katz notes that what saves Sam is his love for Frodo and his humility. His place is in the Shire, with one small garden of a free gardener. Boromir has no love that he sets above the temptation of the ring, no realization that he is not meant for the glory that he desires. Sam remembers his love for Frodo and his own humility, which ultimately saves him. This shows a deep truth that Tolkien brings to light, which is that real strength is not in seizing power so that you can conquer the forces of evil, but in humility, realizing that might does not make right. As Douglas Blunt says, strength, according to Tolkien, manifests itself most clearly not in the exercise of power, but rather in the willingness to give it up. Sam is able to go back to the Shire and flourish because he resisted the temptation of the ring. He is able to become truly what he was meant to be, not because he rose up, sought glory in defeating the Dark Lord, but because he rejected it and cared more for his friend. Power, according to Tolkien, is not the path to happiness. Instead, rejecting power you are not rightly due is the path to happiness. This is a central theme in Tolkien's world, because if you notice, there is no savior in The Lord of the Rings. Unlike other stories, no one is actually able to defeat evil and rise up to be the hero of the story. Gandalf musters the forces of the West to stand together, but he never delivers a decisive blow. Aragorn, the rightful king, manages to squeeze a narrow victory at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but greatly diminishes his forces. After this, all Aragorn can manage to do is lead his remaining troops to the Black Gate as a diversion tactic for Frodo. The characters even know they might be sacrificing their lives to help Frodo, but it's sacrificial love and the rejection of power that ultimately aids the cause. And Frodo, on Mount Doom, is not even able to resist the temptation of the ring and fails to cast it into the fire. In the end, Frodo loses, dooming Middle-earth. It is only when Gollum manages to get the ring from him and accidentally falls over the cliff is Middle-earth saved. There are no saviors in Middle-earth, no one who rises to power and defeats Sauron. And this is a very Christian theme. As Peter Kreeft says, "The ring is so powerful that no creature can overcome it. Similarly, Christianity teaches that sin is so powerful that no creature can overcome it." What actually defeats Sauron in the end is divine providence, which Tolkien even says in his letters, stating Frodo was just an instrument of divine providence. The real hero of the story, according to Tolkien, is God himself, who acted through providence. Gandalf tells Frodo the ring did not intend to be picked up by Bilbo, but there are other powers other than evil that are at work in the world. Bilbo was meant to find the ring and pass it on to Frodo. Gollum was meant to be spared, so he could be divine providence's final blow in defeating Sauron. As Thomas Hibbs says, Gollum is, as Gandalf had predicted, an unwitting instrument of divine providence, but he manages to serve this role only because Frodo had earlier recalled Gandalf's words and taken heart his plea for mercy and patience. The real hero of the story is not any of the characters, but God himself, who designed in the beginning, at the Song of Creation, that evil would ultimately be triumphed over, the same theme we read throughout the Bible. The lesson I believe Tolkien is trying to tell us is that we need not fret about the evil in the world, because God has already designed it so that it will be triumphed over. But we still need to do our part by acting in love when we are called to. Middle-earth doesn't need saviors, it needs servants. No one can be the glorious hero that delivers the final blow to evil. That seat is left only for God, and anyone who attempts to rise up and overpower evil ultimately becomes evil. Instead, the people of Middle-earth, and us likewise, are called to live humbly and be driven by love. If we accept this, we can play a part in the Song of Creation that will lead to the downfall of evil. This is what we see in the characters of The Lord of the Rings, people who know they are too weak to be the hero, but still work to play a part in defeating evil. They act out of love and duty, and this, according to Tolkien, is how we are supposed to live. How we are not supposed to live is embodied in the villains, like Sauron and Saruman, characters who do not act out of love, but with the will to power, and attempt to bend the world to fit their desires. These characters reject their proper place in creation, and instead break out to make their own purpose, with themselves at the center to control all things. For them, might makes right. As noted earlier, Tolkien was a traditionalist who believed the wisdom of the past was essential for guidance on how to act in the present. As Joe Kraus noted, Tolkien rejected modernism in the sense of abandoning the wisdom of the past in favor of new philosophies that are now meant to guide us. Saruman embodies this type of modernism. He is a wizard and a long-time defender of Middle-earth who turns to evil. He abandons the old ways in favor of a new approach to what he thinks will actually help Middle-earth. In the movies, Saruman becomes a servant of Sauron, but in the books it is only a ploy to achieve his real end of being the actual ruler of Middle-earth. Saruman starts out good, trying to help the people of Middle-earth, but becomes frustrated by them. He also obsessively studies the ring, learning of its power, and secretly begins to desire it, so he can use it to shape Middle-earth in his image. In his conversation with Gandalf, he says, "A new power is rising. Against it the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. We can bide our time, we can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order, all the things we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There need not be, there would not be, any real change in our designs, only in our means." Sauron has abandoned the old ways in favor of a new modern path, where the ends now justifies the means. But he comes to view the world the same way his enemy Sauron does. He has no humility and refuses to accept his place as only a steward of Middle-earth. Instead, he seeks to transform the world into what he desires it to be. And notice, it starts with good intentions. He wants to bring knowledge and order to Middle-earth. For Tolkien, evil occurs when one steps out to dominate the world, even for good intentions. We often start with the desire to make the world better. We just need to control it and make it be the way we need it to be. But as Gandalf says, we choose madness over reason. The desire for power itself becomes too tempting and overtakes us. This embodies the villains of Tolkien's world, those who abandon the wisdom of the past because it has not worked the way they assume it should. So instead of going along with the song of creation, waiting for divine providence to triumph over evil and imperfection, they attempt to seize power and do it themselves, which ultimately consumes them. This is very much the mentality of the main villain Sauron. Scholars have noted Sauron embodies the modernist philosophy of Nietzsche, the rejection of traditional religion and the will to power. For those who do not know, Friedrich Nietzsche believed that a new era had arisen, one in which we no longer believed in God and where we could no longer derive morality from God. This led to moral and existential nihilism, in which there is no objective good and evil and no objective purpose for our lives. Out of this, Nietzsche says we all must rise up to become an Übermensch, which is defined as a superior man who could rise above traditional Christian ethics to create and impose their own values and purpose. According to Nietzsche, we can no longer pretend to rely on God. We must become gods in his place. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods, simply to appear worthy of it? For Nietzsche, this was liberating and a glorious realization. Now, each man could derive their own laws, desires, and joys. Each individual could make his or her own purpose in their own roles. But for Tolkien, this was a nightmare. Tolkien said the conflict of the Lord of the Rings is about God and his sole right to divine honor. Sauron desired to be a god king and was held to be one by his servants. Although Tolkien is not directly responding to Nietzsche, he has indirectly crafted Sauron as an Übermensch figure, an entity that rejects his place in the song of creation and attempts to rise up and turn himself into a god king. Sauron forges his own purpose, one in which power is central, and all around him must bend to his will and plan. He is described as one who wants to dominate all life, bend it to his design and purpose. Nietzsche said goodness was everything that heightened the feeling of power, and badness was everything born of weakness. But for Nietzsche, this didn't necessarily mean you would become something like Sauron or a cruel dictator. Instead, for Nietzsche, self-realization and expression in the arts was a better path towards power. Being kind and helping others was a better way to gain power, because others would be indebted to you, and you would have more power in that you had more people willing to help and aid you. But Tolkien saw this philosophy as one that would slowly corrupt. One may start out as good, but slowly the will to power and dominating others would turn you into a dark lord. Sauron embodies this, an angelic-like being who started off as someone who desired to order the world for the better, but is later consumed by his lust for power. Desiring power starts off as a means for something better, but the craving of more power eventually consumes you until it's all you care for. Whereas Nietzsche saw the will to power as a good thing, Tolkien rejected it and taught it would lead to a consuming desire to dominate all others for the sake of power itself. In The Lord of the Rings, the good guys stand against Sauron by rejecting the will to power, embodied in the rejection of the temptation of the One Ring. Peter Kreeft says, "The ring is not a means to any further end. It is Nietzsche's will to power as itself the end." The characters win by rejecting the will to power, and instead choose to act through love and accept their place in creation. Tolkien wrote in a letter, the greatest example of the action of the spirit are in abnegation. For Tolkien, the way to defeat evil is not by seizing power to overcome the enemy, but by rejecting power, choosing love, and playing your part in the song of creation. For Sauron, all that existed was the will to power. Not all fantasy stories hold to this dichotomy. George R.R. Martin's work of A Song of Ice and Fire attempts in many ways to turn the philosophy of Tolkien on its head. Arya Stark, in many ways, is a more positive view of an Ubermensch, more in line with the way Nietzsche would have seen it. She's a young girl who desires to dominate her own life and forge her own purpose. She rejects her traditional place in society and becomes something better. Arya Stark would not fit into Middle-earth. In Tolkien's world, living for power or attempting to make your own purpose is always evil. There's only one good for Tolkien, and that is accepting the plan of God and living for the love of others. You might be tempted to bring up Eowyn of Rohan, the woman who disguises herself as a man and rides off to battle, and ultimately is the one who defeats the Witch King. But Eowyn doesn't ride for power or to become an Ubermensch. She rides for love. Aragorn has rejected her love, and she becomes depressed and wishes to die. After the battle, she comes close to death until Aragorn comes to the House of Healing and revives her. Then notice that Tolkien narrates she falls in love with Faramir, allowing her to find her rightful place. She's not another version of Arya Stark. She's a woman driven by love. The rejection of love causes her to do something she's not supposed to, and only love brings her back from the brink of death. Tolkien, working with his theme of divine providence, uses her actions to bring about a good, the defeat of the Witch King. But she's never driven by the desire to forge her own purpose. She's driven by love and the feeling she has lost her place in the song of creation. Once Faramir falls in love with her, she finds real happiness and becomes a proper lady of Gondor. Comparing Martin and Tolkien's work side by side is actually a good way to see how Nietzsche's Ubermensch philosophy can be viewed in positive and negative lights. I'm not saying either of these authors were intending this, but they do embody the different perspectives on this philosophy within our culture. For Tolkien, it is evil, something that will corrupt us and remove us from worshiping the true God in exchange for worshiping ourselves. For Martin, it is the path to defeat evil and find real meaning. We must reject tradition and rise to become something better. Otherwise, evil from the north will overpower the weakness of tradition. And this brings us to Amazon's show Rings of Power, which gives us a good opportunity to see if it faithfully captures Tolkien's philosophy. So let me ask you this. Which philosophy do you think they're better capturing? Comment below and let me know what you think. But I do not see a lot of Tolkien's ideas in the show. In the Harfoot storyline, tradition is set up as a bad thing, something that holds them back from being kind to others, and the character Nori is working to subvert that tradition.
I thought that it just made sense to ground that in wanting to subvert Harfoot tradition to improve the quality of life.
Tolkien would have rejected this storyline, where tradition or wisdom of the past is painted in a bad light. We do not get clear good and evil characters. Instead, we get morally ambiguous ones. The orcs were cruel and enslaved elves and humans, but then we're told they're really victims who were enslaved by Morgoth, and they're just searching for a homeland of their own. Elrond constantly lies to Durin. He tells Durin in the Mithril Cave that he's not spying on him, after we literally just saw Elrond spying on Durin from the bridge. Gil-galad lies to Elrond, manipulates him, and tries to force him to commit the sin of breaking an oath. These characters are acting more like Sauron, with the mentality that the ends justifies the means. It's okay for Gil-galad to manipulate Elrond, because it will justify his ends. Galadriel is established as the one who understands that evil is still around, so the writers seem to tell us her actions are justified, because if she does not act as she does, the forces of the West will not be ready to stand against the orcs. She acts as if she must rise up and stop evil, when a wise old elf, as she is in the books, should know it is not her job to be the glorious vanquisher of evil. She's not supposed to act as an Ubermensch, someone who rises up, forges her own path to assure the world is made better. She is supposed to understand she's only one part in God's plan for the defeat of evil, not the one who will stop it. Worst of all, she manipulates people to join her cause. She does many evil things and mistreats those around her. She manipulates Halbrand into returning to the Southlands to aid her quest for revenge, even though he found a peaceful life on Numenor. And we as the audience are led to believe that what she is doing is justified, because if she did not act as she did, then the orcs in the Southlands would have killed all the villagers. The Numenorians arrived just in time to save them. It was only because of her manipulative actions that many lives were saved. The writers also confirm that Galadriel is in the right, because the petals of the white tree begin to fall when the Numenorians do not help her with her war, suggesting the Valar believe she is doing what is right. This mentality is antithetical to Tolkien, who strongly believed the ends did not justify the means. The writers have given us a story where evil, manipulative actions are justified. We get a clear sense this is the guiding principle in the first episode. Galadriel is seen as a child, and we're told this is a time before there was evil. She's with her brother Finrod, who tells her we cannot be like the stone that sinks beneath the water in the darkness. We must be like the ship that focuses on the light above us to guide us forward. But Galadriel replies, "But sometimes the light shines just as brightly, reflected in the water, as they do in the sky. It is hard to say which way is up and which way is down. How am I to know which lights to follow?" Later we see her brother replies, "Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness." The whole conversation is not in line with Tolkien's philosophy. Tolkien's world is a struggle between good and evil, but there's always a clear good side and a clear dark side. There's never a point the reader is supposed to get the idea we don't know who is good and who is evil. Goodness for Tolkien is always acting in love and following the plan of God. The only characters who struggle to identify what is good are those who are tempted by evil or succumb to it. One doesn't need to touch the darkness to know what goodness is, because for Tolkien, evil is the perversion of goodness. Later in the show, Halbrand tells Galadriel that he has done many evil things, but Galadriel replies with the line, "Sometimes we must touch darkness to know the light," implying that all the evil he did was justified because it showed him what was good. But in Tolkien's world, there is no indication one sometimes has to do evil or touch the darkness to know what is good. The opening scene may also be suggesting that there is more than one good path. The light above is good, but there is another good we can choose, which is to follow the light reflected in the water. If this is true, this is also a rejection of Tolkien's philosophy, where there can only be one path of goodness. All other paths end in darkness. Galadriel's actions seem to embody this in the first episode, and symbolically show us that there are multiple good paths. The powers that control Middle-earth decide that she must return to Valinor, the land that represents all that is good. We see her and the other elves on the ship looking up at the light of Valinor, but she hesitates, and then she rejects this path, diving into the ocean after the light reflected in the water. This doesn't feel like it's following the philosophy of Tolkien, but injecting foreign philosophy into the world of Middle-earth. In Tolkien's mind, this would be setting her on a path of evil and doom her. But we know, from the audience perspective, she is making the right decision, because evil needs to be stopped. So the plot has her head to Numenor to obtain troops to take the orcs in the Southlands head on. But Tolkien's world is not a place for people to rise up and defeat evil by obtaining more power. Tolkien's world is one of divine providence, where the characters are to act out of love and humility. It is one thing to defend Gondor when it is attacked in the Return of the King, but Tolkien's world doesn't glorify warriors who try to stop evil by going on the offense with power as their means. For Tolkien, this is a path of evil. Galadriel's actions seem to embody how George R.R. Martin would structure a protagonist, but not how Tolkien would. A true Tolkien protagonist would not be acting out of revenge or rise up to be a savior figure, but would be one who acts out of humility and only fights to defend those that they love. Now, of course, it's too early to say if the show creators will turn this around and actually reveal a conclusion that aligns with Tolkien's philosophy. But the seeds they have already sown do not suggest this is the path they are on. It instead suggests a story where the heroes must rise up in an Ubermensch fashion to stop evil from controlling the world. But this path is evil for Tolkien, and if the One Ring has taught us anything, one cannot defeat evil with the weapons of evil. Evil's defeat is already set by divine providence. All the characters are required to do is play their part by acting in love. Finrod's response to Galadriel doesn't fit with Tolkien's vision. His reply sows doubt into the story, that we cannot know what the right path is until we touch evil, as if evil is necessary to help define what is good. If I were to speculate a reply that would fit better with the world of Tolkien, it would probably be more along the lines of pointing out the dangers of thinking that there could be another light below us. A better reply that fits with Tolkien's philosophy would be that there is only one light to follow, and it is the one pointing up. All other lights are illusions, meant to mimic the true light, but we cannot be deceived by them. If you chase the light in the water, you will fall like the stone. Down you will go into darkness, chasing a false light, believing you are really on the right path. Deeper you dig, until you are covered in mud, your eyes becoming used to the darkness, until you forget what you were even chasing. And if you were to turn around and see the true light above you, you would detest it for the pain it caused your eyes. You would come to hate the very thing you thought you were chasing. A creature of darkness would emerge, not beautiful as once was, but a dark lord that detests the light. That is the danger of chasing a false light. It will always lead you into darkness. I hope from this video you get a much better idea of how Tolkien thought and what he envisioned. His stories were meant to teach us these timeless truths, and it is what we should take away from his novels. To see a story in Tolkien's world and not come away with these truths is precisely the problem with Rings of Power. But luckily for us, we always have Tolkien's books, as they were intended to be read. And no matter what show comes along, it will never destroy Tolkien's true works. And for that, we should be grateful to divine providence.